One of the things that Metal Gear Solid 5 gets slammed on very often is its open world. It can be dry, bare bones, empty, there's large expanses. Some people say that the bases in the world aren't designed very well. The way that, outposts will repopulate, the way that it kind of just continues on existing exactly the way it was working before you even got to it, makes it feel very artificial, awkward, and not up to par for what a lot of us expect when it comes to an open world game. For a long time, I agreed with this. I always had fun with Metal Gear Solid 5. I think its gameplay loop is really good. I think it has a decent sandbox, and the way that the enemies try to counter your tactics are pretty interesting, at least in the beginning of the game. Because after a while you just get so overpowered that it doesn't even matter. A lot of time's gone by since Metal Gear Solid 5 has come out, and I think it's worth revisiting its open world in comparison to a lot of the open world games that we have today, both good games and bad games. And I figure what we'll do is we'll take a look at some of the games that do really good open worlds and some of the games that do really bad open worlds, and we'll see where Metal Gear Solid 5 fits along that spectrum. Is it terrible? Is it great? Is it mediocre? And if any of those, how so? So I'm Pliskin, and today we're going to be talking about whether or not Metal Gear Solid 5's open world is hot garbage or better than we give it credit for. So what is an open world game? I feel like the definition for that has become so muddled. I mean, back in the day you could just look and say, oh yeah, Grand Theft Auto. That's an open world game, just a wide, open, expansive area with the limits being very far from the middle of the map and you having just unlimited freedom to do whatever you want to do. But I feel like it's gotten so much more complicated than that now, because we have games that are very open in design, but are not open world. A great example of this would be Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes. There you have a very expansive, large, open base with multiple entry points into different areas, multiple routes that you could take for extraction, and multiple strategies that are all viable once you get to know the map. But here's the thing. It's not this endless expanse, it's a small chunk of an island, the corner of it. You can't go off the island and swim in the ocean, and you can't drive beyond the base. It's a big open area, but at the end of the day, it's a smaller, densely packed area where every single spot has purpose. The holding cells on the edge of the cliff there, that has the purpose of holding prisoners. It also makes for a good starting point on certain missions, or a point where you can come over and, hide prisoners on the cave that's nearby there. The main admin building serves as the biggest challenge on the map, the area that's going to be the most heavily guarded with, cameras and heavier troops, some armored vehicles, and it's a lot more dense with a lot of hallways that enemies can get the drop on you in. Everything has been designed for you to approach it a certain way. A great example of this would be when you finish rescuing Chico, you can go, you find a truck, you hop into the truck, and it'll take you right into the admin base. That was designed. That was a set piece that was structured in a way where A needs to happen for B to happen, and then that'll lead to C. And you're supposed to follow that design route. In an open world game, going back to the old school GTAs, there is no A, B, or C. It can happen in any order. There is no designed route because it's just endlessly open and you can go anywhere at any time for anything. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of open world games, and in the modern landscape, it's becoming harder and harder to establish that kind of go anywhere, anytime for anything, as these open world games try to introduce narratives and more complex elements to them. So, let's start this off by talking about a couple games that manage to do this kind of go anywhere, anytime for anything, and stay true to those original principles of an open world design. Far Cry 4 has got to be one of my most favorite open world games. It takes the basis of Far Cry 3, where the open world is this endless space that you can explore to your heart's content with hidden secrets and things that you can pick up, But it adds more to that. You see, the open world starts off as not necessarily restrictive, but foreign. You need to fill up your map by going to these towers to unlock checkpoints. You need to free enemy outposts in order to have a safer time maneuvering around the region. You need to hunt animals and plants to upgrade yourself and your gear. There's things to do within the open world that has you interacting with things in it or things that are directly a part of it in order to make your traversal and exploration of the open world work. Far Cry 4 also does an excellent job, I'd argue more so than Far Cry 3, of making the open world feel alive, and that's something not a lot of open world games can really do. I mean, again, let's look at the older GTAs. Those worlds felt kind of artificial, like NPCs would walk, but that's about it. They felt like they were just there for you to punch them, shoot them, or run them over. In Far Cry 4, you have NPCs that will talk to each other. You have animals that will hunt other animals. You have, active conflicts going on that will play out whether or not you decide to intervene. So this element of you having to get to know the world and unlock it, as well as this other element of just having the world be alive without you, makes it feel really fun to just explore. It doesn't matter if there's an A, B, or C route because things are happening no matter which route you take, all the time. Of course, you get more linear missions that take place in certain parts of the world where it has to be a little bit more restrictive, and that's where that kind of discrepancy between, open-ended freedom and exploration and then trying to tell an actual story. But for the most part, Far Cry 4 does a really good job of making its world really fun to traverse and keeping that open world feeling exploration immersive when you're going throughout it.
I got some jelly beans. You like jelly beans?
On the note of Rockstar Games, let's take a look at another amazing open world game. Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, Red Dead Redemption 2 is stellar in the sense that it manages to have this wide, expansive map and have it have these open expanses where you're just riding your horse for minutes at a time, but it keeps it fun. And this is something I want to bring up that's really important in an open world. You see, Far Cry 4 was fun because there's always things happening and the world's existing around you all the time. But something that it does, as well as Red Dead Redemption 2 here, is that when you have those wide open expanses, the traversal is fun. Traversal is a key component to a game where you're going to spend a lot of time walking from whatever points you decide to walk to. Far Cry 4 does this through the glider, vehicles, and animals that you can ride, and Red Dead Redemption 2 does this and goes above and beyond with this by having your horse, a living entity that carries all of your gear, your upgrades, your items, a horse that you need to take care of, a horse that you need to build a bond with. So every second you're riding in this open expanse, you're developing something, you're achieving something by strengthening your bond with your horse, or you might want to stop somewhere and actually brush your horse or take care of it to make sure it's in top tier condition. So the act of traversal takes some thought to it, and Red Dead Redemption uses this to make sure that you're never bored just going over these wide expanses of desert, for example. But it's not just traversal that it does right. You have these random events and NPCs that feel very lively. Red Dead Redemption 2 manages, at least in its open world segments, to create NPCs that feel like regular people. You can interact with these people, albeit in a very basic way, but you can constantly change their mood or, be a part of whatever they're doing. You could be nice to them, you could be mean to them, you could try to diffuse a tense situation, or you can escalate it. These people are going to react to things you're doing, things you're wearing, things you say to them. And it's just such a little thing, but it makes a world of difference. You'll sometimes find these scripted events when you're in towns or out in the wild, and this helps the game stay exciting and fresh and make you feel like you're part of something bigger, which is really important in making sure your open world doesn't feel empty. Couple this together with the open-ended side quests and the fact that you can go hunting or collect plants, again, just like in Far Cry 4, albeit in Red Dead Redemption 2, the crafting kind of serves a different purpose, but it still has that element of just, you are in this world that is already inhabited, and not being in a world that's inhabited for you.
Anal?
But perhaps, or you know what, no, not even perhaps, I'm not going to play this neutrally. The apex open world game is Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. I've made a video talking about why this game is the best open world game, and if you haven't watched it, I recommend you do. But in short, or in summary for what's relevant to this video, Breath of the Wild is a step above Far Cry 4 and Red Dead Redemption 2 because it features a lot of the things those games have with interaction and environments that exist with or without you, but it also goes a step further by giving you a world that is the actual thing that you're competing against, interacting with all the time. And you might be thinking, Pliskin, what the fuck are you talking about? Let me explain. In Red Dead Redemption 2, the world feels inhabited and it feels like I need to stay on my toes because of random events that happen, because of needing to feed myself or take care of my horse. In Far Cry 4, it feels active because you see the wildlife at work because of the NPC interactions and because you need to use what shows up in the world in order to upgrade yourself. But in Breath of the Wild, the world itself is what you're playing with. The world does this by having what I like to call an elemental gameplay loop, or an elemental level of design. And by that I mean that the elements within the open world, earth, wind, fire, water, electricity, metal, they all act on a consistent rule set. If I am somewhere that is too cold, I need to either put on some warmer clothing, or I need to hunt down food and make it spicy to give myself cold resistance. So having this kind of elemental rule set in play when you're going throughout the world makes it so that the world itself, the base elements that make up this world that you are traveling through, are a core part of the gameplay experience. So The Legend of Zelda has all the features that you see in Red Dead Redemption 2 and Far Cry 4. However, it takes the actual world itself and the natural rule set that would exist in any world, like, you know, even our real world, and applies them into a video game setting. And being able to interact with all this on that level of detail makes it so that the game isn't so much about you playing down a restricted set of pathways for combat. You know, for example, Red Dead Redemption 2, I'm always going to be shooting things, or I'm always going to be stabbing things, or I'm always going to be choking things if I'm fighting them. Far Cry 4, I'm always going to be shooting, stabbing, or blowing something up. Breath of the Wild, I could be using the actual world and elements around me in order to gain the upper ground. That's crazy, and I haven't seen that replicated on that scale. Red Dead Redemption 2 has it so that if you get too cold or too hot, you need to change your clothing, but Breath of the Wild just takes it to a whole new level. That's why I think it's the best open world game out there, because even if it is just a boring expanse of land, you're constantly interacting and competing with those elements, so you're constantly playing something. But those are good open worlds. And we can't just compare Metal Gear Solid 5 to good open worlds, because then we'll just be like, well, Metal Gear Solid 5 doesn't really have any crazy elemental action, it doesn't really have, you know, weather effects that affect what you have to wear, and it doesn't have, you know, food that you need to hunt or that kind of interaction with the world, so I guess it's bad. No, that would not be fair. Because there is something special about Metal Gear Solid 5 that makes you want to play it, even though it doesn't have 90% of the features I've been talking about in all these other games. So before we really start looking into Metal Gear Solid 5, we need to talk about some bad open world games. You might think with Far Cry 4 being one of my favorite open world games of all time, that would mean the later entries would build up on everything great and, you know, just make it even better, perhaps elevate the series to heights like Breath of the Wild, but no, that's not what's happened. So the first terrible open world game we're going to look at is Far Cry 6. Now, I've taken apart this game's sandbox before. I've talked about why it has like a lack of genuine content, and I'm gonna elaborate on that content part a little bit right now. You see, I enjoyed Far Cry 6 for my first playthrough. But when I finished the game, I realized why I was enjoying it so much. It wasn't because of a vast open world that I need to interact with and get to know in order to grow stronger and gain certain points to allow myself and my faction to slowly start taking over the world. It wasn't because there were interesting ways of traversal, and it wasn't because, I had to constantly compete with wildlife that was coming after me and really understand the strategies in place for just going from point A to point B. No. With Far Cry 6, the fun came in once I reached point B, and the next set-piece mission took place. I said before, I don't know why Far Cry 6 was an open world, because the only time the game really has, interesting interaction, developments, or just fun gameplay is when I'm actually in a story mission, and there's a wild scripted set-piece happening. In the open world, the guards are brain dead, so I could be walking through the street and walk right past a tank while I have my AS Val out, and it's not going to flinch. I can walk right up to a guard that'll be cordially asking me to put away my weapon and then stab him in the throat. I could be walking through the jungle for 5 minutes on end and not come across one predator or one animal that I need to hunt in order to unlock better gear. Instead, I just have to look around for these tiny little boxes. And you know what? In open world games, having little side objectives to go around and find, smaller little trinkets to get an achievement or unlock a special piece of gear is totally fine. But when that's the main focus of the open world, it becomes a walking simulator. Far Cry 4 was beautiful because it constantly had that challenge of trying to survive the world, whether it was the guards or the animals or, traversing the game's excellent usage of verticality when going across the open world. Far Cry 6, it's just kind of like, it looks really pretty. And I mean, it looks really pretty, but that's all there is to it. There is no substance. It's kind of like going back to those really old school Rockstar games where the open world is just this big expansive place where you're supposed to marvel at the scale and then interact with things that were clearly placed just for the sole existing purpose to entertain me when I come across them. It feels very artificial, and because of that, it's boring. But sometimes you can pack an open world game full of interesting things to do and full of complex mechanics, and it can still be a trash experience.
Make sure you get a good shot of my muscles. Ooh, got room for two? Aha.
Let's talk about Ghost Recon Breakpoint. In theory, this should be the greatest game ever made. A game where I need to stealth around this open world where there's enemies attacking me from the ground, drones that require different strategies to get past, a healing system that's not, regenerating health, but instead, actual healing items that I need to get, interesting animations, base camps that I can set up to give myself certain buffs by eating or by resting, NPCs and hub worlds and all this kind of stuff, tons of realistically modeled guns. I should be in paradise, but I'm not. And while I can boot this game up and play it just for shits and giggles every now and then, it's nowhere near as bad as Far Cry 6 because again, there's still challenge and there is still content. It's not on the level of Far Cry 4. It's not on the level of Red Dead Redemption 2, and it's not on the level of Breath of the Wild. And this is why. So little of all of these extra complex mechanics actually matter to the gameplay. That really cool system about setting up bases and having buffs doesn't really matter. I can go throughout the entire game and not use those. Having all of these super detailed modeled guns doesn't really matter because it doesn't take much to unlock upgrades for them like suppressors or optics. Half the time they come with that stuff. They don't really feel all that different from each other. The sandbox is bland. It's not like there's certain guns that let me get past the more bullet spongy enemies. I just have to kind of lay down and do headshots, which is very Far Cry 6, and that's repetitive and boring as fuck. The enemies don't feel dynamic or like they're existing in the open world. They're just kind of walking around, hoping that I bump into them. They feel like they're there just to entertain me. There's this really cool feature where when you're crawling, you can use like the actual camo of the ground, so you can put like mud or sand up on you to make it harder for enemies to see you and, you know, conceal your heat signature from drones. That's really cool, but I mean, like, it's just a little side gimmick that half the time doesn't really matter. And then, you know, at least with Far Cry 6, I cared a little bit because there were some elements of the story that I actually got into, but here it's like, I don't care about anything that's going on. There's no real stakes or there's no real mystery. Like, I don't care about all these team members I'm supposed to look for. I don't care about these people that I'm talking to. Like, it just feels very modern Ubisoft. Soulless. It's another grossly enlarged landmass that's just wide expanses as I go from point A to point B to try to find fun in whatever mission I'm going on. An open world game shouldn't be fun only when you're in a mission. The open world is the appeal. But yeah, this one's just filled with so many things that don't matter, and the gameplay loop doesn't warrant all of these complex mechanics. So, in theory, this should be the greatest game of all time, but in practice, it's soulless. So, here we are. We've seen the greats, and we've seen the soulless, bottomless pit of what an open world can be. So where does that put Metal Gear Solid 5? Well, it's definitely not Breath of the Wild, Red Dead Redemption 2, or Far Cry 4, because the open world is nowhere nearly as immersive. But at the same time, it's not as bad as Breakpoint or Far Cry 6 in the sense that the open world just feels like a set piece or empty, or you just need the missions to have fun. Because in Metal Gear Solid 5, the gameplay loop, as well as the sandbox inhabiting the world, is fun enough to the point where the world itself is enough as a facilitator to that kind of gameplay. Let's take the first mission of this open world game. You have to go and rescue Kaz in Afghanistan, but before you can find Kaz, you need to search the base that has info as to where his whereabouts are. So the game starts you off with this introductory cutscene, where Ocelot is established as the guy that's going to be guiding you on your way, and then you're just off, you and your horse and the bare essentials of the weapon sandbox and enemies that you encounter. Now, as you start encountering enemies and as you start seeing things, Ocelot will comment on the fact that, hey, you're approaching enemies, you might want to take it slower. He'll start explaining the gameplay loop, saying find high ground, scout the base, see what enemies are there, plan your route in, and then adapt on your way out. That's the core loop of Metal Gear Solid 5, and that's perfectly explained and exemplified in this first mission. But it's not just the fact that Ocelot is telling you what's going on, and it's not just the fact that the sandbox and the controls feel good, the mechanics are all warranted. It's the fact that the open world itself still ties into what you're doing here. You see, it's not like Ghost Recon where there's a bunch of pointless mechanics that have nothing to do with the gameplay that you're, enacting in this open world. And it's not Far Cry 6 where when you're not in a story of strictly guided set pieces, the open world is just eye candy or set dressing for you. No, here the open world actually ties into the aforementioned gameplay loop. The different high rises or plateaus that overlook the bases are perfect for that first step where you scout out the base. The bases themselves are well designed enough where there's multiple entry points, each posing their own sets of challenges and benefits. And then the gameplay is interesting enough as well as, the tighter map design in these narrower bases, where if something goes wrong and you need to improvise, it all feels very natural and intuitive. So the world itself is still feeding into this gameplay loop, and this mission exemplifies that. But again, it's not like those other two games because you don't need the missions to feel this. As you're going out throughout the world, you'll find different supply crates that you can Fulton, animals that you can Fulton, plant life that you can collect. That all ties into the game's hardcore base building motif. There's areas in the game that feel really well designed. Of course, you do have those open expanses of nothingness that can be kind of boring, and the world would definitely benefit from shrinking down a little bit. But there are sections, segments, or areas of the map where you get some really unique stealth encounters and the gameplay loop is affected in a positive way. For example, you have this misty valley by a waterfall in the African map, where the enemy actually has the advantage because all of the high ground is up along their side of the river. So you need to stick to the bushes and play it extra safe, because that first part of the gameplay loop where you're supposed to scout ahead is a lot harder to do now. 1, because of the fog, and 2, because the land is in the enemy's favor. Then of course you have really cool bases, for example Gazeba Camp. Gazeba Camp is based almost in like a circle formation, with the lowest part of the map being in the center and the higher parts where you do your scouting being along the edges. So you can move all along the different edges of the base, and as long as you're careful for patrols and the watchtowers, you can use the verticality of the actual arena to help you scout out. But then when you're also infiltrating, you get a good sense of where you are and how vulnerable you are, depending on how high or low you are, how close you are to the middle of that base. You have the watchtowers that are positioned in a really good way. You have a couple interiors that make stealth tense, when you're opening a door and you can't scan through walls, so you don't know if there's going to be a guy in there. It's a really cool designed area. So does this warrant Metal Gear Solid 5 as being a good open world game? I mean, kind of. It still feels very empty, the gameplay can get very repetitive, and the open world can feel very bare bones, and the AI that's in it does kind of feel like it's there just for you to encounter and interact with, kind of like in the way the older GTAs were, or Ghost Recon Breakpoint or Far Cry 6 are. But it's not as bad as those games for all the reasons I just talked about. If anything, I can compare it to another unfinished open world video game, Halo Infinite.
What is this?
Like Metal Gear Solid 5, Halo Infinite has a really killer gameplay loop. So when you're going around this empty world with NPCs that just kind of wait around for you, it kind of gets away with it, because you're constantly interacting with that really fun gameplay and the world is just facilitating that. So for example, Halo's gameplay loop is you start off with a set of weapons, you see enemies, you make conscious decisions of how you're going to attack, who you're going to start with first based on the weapons you have, the weapons they have, and the enemies that are there. And then during the actual combat, you switch out your weapons depending on the different enemy combinations and map layouts that's there. And again, verticality plays in really cool ways. Now, Halo kind of differentiates itself in the sense that Halo Infinite can get away with having emptier areas, because a good part of Halo would be after the fights, just having these quiet moments where you get to look at this weird alien landscape. But still, like Metal Gear Solid 5 for the most part, it's missing a lot of those really interactive and immersive elements to the world itself that can really draw you in and make it something special. Now, of course, if you're watching this in the future, hopefully Halo Infinite has been patched and updated. And who knows, maybe it's leagues ahead of Metal Gear Solid 5, but as of right now, it's a good analogy. So with that in mind, and having that game there as a comparing point, I think we can say that Metal Gear Solid 5 is a okay open world game. It definitely has its flaws, but ultimately it's still really fun and stands above bad open world games. So I hope throughout all that rambling I somehow got my point across. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, leave a like, subscribe. If you have something you want to mention that you feel like I didn't mention throughout this video about any of the games that I brought up, go right on ahead. Or if you can think of other examples of good or bad open worlds. I know there's one guy in the comments that always comes around and is like, open worlds are the worst thing since cancer. So I know what you're gonna say, but everyone else, if you have an open world game you want to talk about, go ahead down in the comments. Anyways, this has been Pliskin, over and out.